Good afternoon, or good morning to those of you in the West Coast. Welcome to Venable and to our program today entitled Impact Investing in Nonprofits, Opportunities, Innovative Structures, and Creative New Ways to Raise Funds and Further Your Mission. My name is Jeff Tenenbaum, Chair of the Nonprofit Organizations Practice at the Venable Law Firm. And for those of you who are repeat attendees at these programs, this is part of our monthly series that we do every month on various nonprofit legal topics, both here in our Washington, D.C. office and around the country for those of you dialed in on the webinar. We have what I think is a record crowd for in-person attendance here today. We had over 160 people register in person. Thankfully, not all of you showed up because that might have been a tight fit. We actually had an overflow room with video just in case. And we have 250 people registered on the webinar across the country. So this is clearly one of the most, either one of the most popular topics or a collection of our most dynamic speakers or some combination of the two. But this is a terrific program that I personally spent a lot of time working on and developing, and I'm very excited about. It's an area in which we in our nonprofit practice at Venable do a lot of work, and we're really excited about today's program. We're also especially excited because we have a co-sponsor for today's program, Inside NGO. Graciously agreed to co-sponsor this program with us, and we're very excited about that here today. A few housekeeping matters. First of all, for those of you from the Trade and Professional Association community, these programs are eligible for a Certified Association Executive Continuing Education credit. As I said, we've been doing these programs now for about 5.5 years. They've become very popular, and we have our next 3 programs already scheduled. February 4th, next month, our topic is Nonprofit Chapters and Affiliates, finding structures and relationships that address your challenges and work well for everyone. On March 10th, our program is entitled Nonprofit Federal Award Recipients, Establishing an Ethical Culture, Appropriate Internal Controls, and Collaborative Relationships with Your Federal Agency. That program also is co-sponsored by Inside NGO. We tend to do one program each year focused on federal award issues, grants, cooperative agreements, contracts for nonprofits, and this will be our annual foray into that topic. And we have, amongst our other speakers, a key person from the Inspector General's office at USAID, who we're very excited will be part of that panel. And then on April 14th, a topic that we probably cover at least once every other year, the UBIT, unrelated business income tax, what your nonprofit needs to know about sponsorships, advertising, royalties, and cause marketing. So we have, I think, a terrific and diverse collection of upcoming programs that I hope you will join us for. A few other matters. Those of you in the room here in D.C. have a handout booklet in front of you that has copies of the PowerPoint slides from today's program, along with a bibliography of some very helpful additional articles and other resources on impact investing in nonprofits, along with full speaker bios. Because we have so much to cover today, I'm not really going to get into the bios of our speakers, but I encourage you to take a look at those in your program books when you have an opportunity. Those of you in the webinar were emailed a copy of the PowerPoint slides, and everyone tomorrow will receive an email that contains a recording of today's program, along with all of the PowerPoint slides and handout materials. Feel free to forward that on to colleagues and others who would benefit from that. So of course these programs are being recorded, and we post all of those the day after the event on our nonprofit YouTube channel. You can find a link to that on the last slide in today's PowerPoint presentation. In terms of questions today, because we have a lot of material to cover, as you can tell by the slide deck, and also because we have limited time and so many participants, here's what we're going to do. We're going to ask you, if you have a really critical burning question, here in the room, raise your hand. I'll call on you. Wait for the microphone so that everyone on the webinar can hear your question. If it's not so burning of a question, try to hold it, and we'll save some time at the end for questions. Those of you in the webinar, pose your questions at any time to me using the chat feature on the software. I can guarantee you we will not be able to get to all of the questions, but I will try to pose as many as I can to our speakers at appropriate times. Finally, our speakers. First, to my immediate right is Tom Dente. Tom is Chief Operating Officer at Inside NGO. We're very pleased that Tom is and Inside NGO are partnering with us today. Tom has, in addition to being COO at Inside NGO, has a lot of personal experience and passion for this issue, has devoted some real time and effort to it, and we're really excited he's going to join us today for some preliminary kind of overview remarks. Our second speaker today to my far right is Kevin Saunders. Kevin was kind enough to fly down from Boston to join us today. He is Deputy General Counsel at, I always get this wrong, how do you pronounce it? Axion International. It's a private nonprofit organization with a mission of giving people the financial tools they need to improve their lives. And then finally, in the middle here is Camille Cook, who gave us a little scare by showing up about 2 minutes prior to start time, but she made it, thankfully. Thank you, Anita Drummond, for being willing to step in if Camille didn't show up. But thankfully, Camille is here. She is senior attorney at the Nature Conservancy, and she's a transactional attorney who advises the Nature Conservancy's impact investment division called NatureVest on a range of complex transactional issues. Camille and Kevin are both very experienced attorneys in the impact investing area. This is, as all of you probably know, this is still a very emerging area for nonprofits and for-profits and others alike. It's a complicated area that touches on kind of a complex array of legal and regulatory and tax issues. We're going to try to simplify it for you as best as we can, give you an idea of kind of the overview and landscape of what's out there, what's happening, what kind of options are available to you as nonprofit organizations. And this program is obviously focused from the nonprofit perspective, how you can take advantage of impact investing to help raise funds, to further your mission, and otherwise help further your own nonprofit organization. And we're going to do our best to try to do that for you here today. So without any further ado, let me turn it over to Tom to get us started. Tom?
Good. Well, good afternoon, good morning to those on the West Coast. I'm Tom Dente. I'm the COO of Inside NGO, and it's just a pleasure to see such a large group made up of so many different organizations. Given the importance of this topic, Inside NGO is delighted to partner with Venable on this issue and then have a great panel discussion today. So we're really looking forward to both the discussion that we'll start with as well as just the start of the dialogue that we'll have today as well. But to get us started, what we thought we would do is just walk through some brief overview or introductory materials just to frame the broader conversation within the panel. So let me kick us off and start us there. And you can't start any overview without getting back to definitions. And if you think about what is impact investing, here's a simple definition in front of you. Impact investing is the investments intended to generate positive social and or environmental impact and which generate financial returns involving a diverse group of stakeholders. That sounds good, but then when you start to think about what's behind the words and you start to think about what does investments mean? You start to think about what are the instruments? What's the structure of these investments? When you think about questions of social or environmental impact, you begin to wrestle with the question of how are these measured? Over what time period are you measuring social or environmental impact? And then when you get to the complex question of financial returns, questions of how large are those financial returns? How large should they be to meet mission requirements and risk requirements? How are they generated? And again, over what period of time? And then when you think about stakeholders, you're just really struck by the diversity of actors involved in this. Investors, philanthropists, venture capitalists, different types of NGOs, different types of businesses, different types of donors. And so what starts off to be a very simple definition, when you start to step into it a bit, you start to realize there's just this underlying complexity, and we want to talk a bit more about that today. And what drives that complexity and what prompts those questions is that this, as Jeff alluded to, is a very complex and dynamic ecosystem that we tried to simplify here. And when you think about this ecosystem, you think about it starting with the people who are really shaping this environment, people involved in policy, be it tax or other regulatory bodies as well, the media to a certain extent, academia, think tanks. So you think about the players shaping this broader evolving ecosystem. Right underneath that, you think about the supporting market infrastructure, as we called it here, the different types of financial institutions who are involved, the different types of investments, intermediaries, investors who form a market that channels the capital appropriately. And then you start to think about also the different types of technical assistance required, especially as you think about measurement or certification or monitoring on those different types of non-financial returns. So there's those shaping and supporting elements. And then if you're an NGO, you're in this circle in the middle. Your challenge is we need to grow our impact or scale our impact. So when we start to think about that, we're moving from a lot of our traditional programming with traditional instruments providing benefits to our stakeholders, the green boxes, if you will, in front of you, and we're wrestling with this question of how do we take market-based instruments or return-seeking capital in a variety of different forms, ranging from impact investing funds to different types of social enterprises, commercial investors, corporates, even traditional donors, and saying, how do we take that blue area and sprinkle it through or blend it appropriately within our missions, within our programs, and within our strategies so we can deliver impact at scale for the stakeholders. So that's the challenge that I think all of us face. And when you think about the complexity of this environment, you begin to see very quickly that your organization or any NGO can play multiple roles. You can be a recipient of different forms of impact investing capital. You can be an investor with others or by yourself in different types of opportunities. You can provide technical assistance based upon your capabilities and the domains and the geographies in which you work. And depending upon the opportunity and how fluid the environment is, you can play multiple roles as well. And so when you think about that, you start to see the complexity of requirements, both in terms of what does it take for us to be successful as we take on some of these different roles. And because of that, I think what we're seeing across NGOs is this need for more collaboration, saying it's a newer opportunity for us. We face a series of newer requirements, and how do we come together to support each other better? And so one example of that is, Inside NGOs partnered with PACT and Mercy Corps and Andy and Goal to try to establish a regular forum for this. And I know there's other forums as well, but the whole challenge of collaboration is what can we do to learn more together first so we can share practices and sector knowledge? How do we collaborate more and put in place the mechanisms that allow us to share insights and also look for ways to partner more and innovate together? And then lastly, given the newness of this area, relatively speaking, how do we stand together to properly advocate for the unique benefits that if you're an impact investor in working through this sector and working through NGOs, through skilled organizations, you can generate not only the mission returns, but also financial returns too. And in the course of our conversations and work with members, what we hear are a series of needs. And these may not be too dissimilar from what you're hearing in your own organizations. The first big area is this whole category of organizational readiness. Are we ready to take this on? And multiple different facets to this depending upon where you are in your life cycle being involved in impact investing. So the whole question of, have we done the proper internal advocacy across our organization, just given what this opportunity could mean? Have we done the cultural change in some cases too, not only to get started, but because some of these opportunities and some of these investments, if you will, may not pay off, are we ready for failure? And what does that mean for us as an organization? The second big area is, have we done the work internally to what one of our members called map our assets, or do some asset mapping approaches where we identify the unique capabilities, the opportunities, and the gaps we may have as organizations so we know what we can offer and what we need. And then the communications challenge too, both with our stakeholders, that very big, diverse group of stakeholders, how we properly communicated what we're doing with impact investing, and then also have we embedded this within our overall strategy, within our overall organizational strategy or our program strategy. And then lastly, making sure we have the right new skills and the right dedicated focus, because this is a multi-year journey for a lot of organizations. And have we thought through what skills over time, dedicated skills over time would look like? So again, if you think about that area of organizational readiness, a lot of different needs there. I think in terms of the opportunities themselves, what we hear a lot from our members, and again, you may be facing these same questions too, is as we're beginning to look and shape new opportunities to use this new source of capital and funding, have we really thought through the governance and the corporate structure options? What co-investment funds or other shared opportunities can we participate in some cases to gain more funding, in other cases to help us mitigate our risk? And then lastly, the complexity of this and some of the legal and tax issues. What are the funding structures, the sources, the different types of instruments and the options best available to us? And then once you get started, how do you sustain this over time? And a lot of our members are talking about the issue of, what's the infrastructure support that we need in order to play appropriately across a newer value chain for us, which is doing proper due diligence on an opportunity, the risk management pieces, investment expertise if we're an active investor and playing that role, incubation if we're starting a new social enterprise to support one of our mission or program goals. And then lastly, this whole area of measurement, taking traditionally what we would do in monitoring and evaluation and perhaps evolving it given some of the needs. And so when you start to think about that and supporting that type of an infrastructure over time, making the right investments, or as suggested here too, looking across the sector, looking across others to say, where can we share some of this infrastructure in order to do what we do well, but not replicate what we could use or contract from someone else? So when you put this all together, what you start to see is, there's a lot of opportunity here for us to scale our impact, but some real requirements though too in order for us to get this right, both immediately and longer term.
Tom, that was a terrific overview and very helpful. I might add one more box to your last slide if you want to go back, and that is that as you're going to hear Camille and Kevin talk about a lot, kind of the legal and regulatory and tax framework that governs this area, it's a bit of kind of fitting a square peg into a round hole, and we're stuck with, for instance, an IRS federal tax exemption framework that never had impact investing in these sorts of complex arrangements between nonprofits and for-profits in mind when it was written. And even the existing IRS rulings and other guidance, which is sparse in the area, doesn't really effectively address these issues. There's certainly no proactive regulations or anything else to kind of pave the way for this to occur. Even at the state corporate law side, there's really not a perfect structure that's available for these sorts of arrangements. Other federal regulatory structures like Securities and Exchange Commission, there's a lot of difficult, complex regulatory issues that come into play. So I might add a fourth box, which is kind of educating those federal and state regulators and advocating for change. I personally believe that's really going to be necessary in order to really take this whole area of impact investing to the next level, to really further and be able to effectively further the goals and missions of nonprofit organizations. For instance, we work with the Nature Conservancy a lot. I know Camille and others at the Conservancy, we've had many discussions about how many strict restrictions and limitations you have to put on these arrangements in order to avoid, for instance, going down the path of impermissible private benefit and things like that. That's not to say that the tax code should be rewritten, to trash the whole regulatory scheme that exists, but there's going to have to be changes. There's going to have to be accommodations. There's going to have to be education, and the nonprofit, the NGO community is going to have to play a key role in that process.
Right, and so I guess the conclusion of that is, very strongly, is that the more we can collaborate, and then also just being, I think, as Jeff nicely summarized, given the complexity of this environment, making sure we have the right skills in an area which is really, characterized by both, as you said, I love the analogy of, a square peg into a round hole, but it's the creativity and it's a bit of the innovation and helping to drive some of the innovation and regulation in the work that you do and being able to share that holistically so we have that common agenda. I think some really interesting opportunities for this group to think as we move ahead.
Exactly. And on that note, we're going to hear from some sharing of examples and success in this area. I know Inside NGO had a conference on this topic a few months ago that was very successful, and we and Inside NGO and others will continue to have these opportunities to share some of these experiences so you can learn, get ideas, and then collaborate. Kevin?
Yeah, thanks Jeff. Thanks Tom for that introduction and for hosting Venable Inside NGO. I think this is a continuation of a lot of conversations around impact investing that have been going on for the past few years. I wanted to mention two other groups that I know that are working actively in this area more from a legal point of view, but one is the GIN, the Global Impact Investing Network. They have a legal working group in addition to their broader impact investing activities, as well as an impact investing legal working group, which is sponsored primarily by a professor at NYU Law School, Deb Barand, who runs an international transactions clinic. If that is of interest, I can connect people to that group. So there are a lot of groups having these conversations, and Tom and I were discussing how there probably will be some coalescing of those groups, some merging of those groups as interests align, and as we become aware of each other. But a lot of good conversations going on. I want to I guess I am the Deputy General Counsel of Axion International. I've been there for nine and a half years. I spend most of my time working with our investments team on the work that we do. For those of you who aren't familiar with Axion, Jeff mentioned our mission statement. We work to reduce vulnerability, increase opportunity through access to financial services to those who've not had access before. What does that mean? We want to create financial inclusion, and you can see on the slide how we define financial inclusion. Again, thinking about the financial services that we all have access to in our daily lives that stabilize, help support us in our day-to-day activities. Massive amounts of the global population do not have access for many reasons and could benefit. We're trying to bridge that gap. Of course, it started with a focus on microcredit, and I'll get to that in a moment. But where we are today, and what I'd like to share is the story of Axion, how we've become an impact investing organization, and having that as a primary activity, not just as a side project. It happened organically over time, so we're in a slightly different place than I think a lot of organizations that are very established, have many different activities, and are now looking at those activities and saying, is there some way that we can incorporate an investing or commercial approach to create larger impact or to create funding opportunities, et cetera. But I think that our story will be, I think, informative, even though it was organic, because I think there are lessons learned. And Camille, I think, will give you the perspective of that organization that is trying to build impact investing into a larger infrastructure. What we do now is we engage with our partners on three different levels. One is the actual investment. But in addition to the investments that we make, we also engage often at a management level, meaning we will, when we enter in investments, also provide line managers into the institutions, or a lesser role would be a technical assistance provider around a key functional area. If we're talking about microfinance institutions, maybe they need help with their credit methodologies. Maybe they need help with their risk management, or HR, things like that we've identified as weaknesses. When we've targeted the institution for the relationship, we provide expertise to help them with that. The other side, again, you can see investments sort of right in the middle. On the other side of investment, we take governance very seriously and include it as part of our sort of specified engagement with our portfolio companies, meaning if we're saying that these companies, whether they be microfinance institutions or other financial service companies, if we're saying that they can have impact if they're successful, we have to in some way ensure that they are being guided towards that impact. And so as we come in as investors, we have a role to play as a shareholder of the company. We typically have a board seat and at the least have a board observer seat. Why? Because we feel like that's one of the key areas where our impact thesis has to be heard, and the guidance of the organization at that level needs to stay true to what we initially viewed as the possible impact of the organization. So at the management level, technical assistance level, the governance level, all of those pieces are included when we build an investment relationship with our partners.
Kevin, before you go on, I think it might be helpful, two things. First, maybe just so everyone's on the same page, just to explain generally what you mean by microfinance and how those institutions work. And then the second point, which I think is very interesting and fairly unique about you guys, although not unique in the impact investment world, is the fact that you are investing in what I presume are generally for-profit institutions, not some nonprofit you're partnering up with, and maybe to speak to that for a minute as well.
Yeah. So historically, and I'll again go into a bit more detail in a moment. We have worked in the microcredit space, and I think many people are vaguely familiar, perhaps more familiar with Muhammad Yunus and his operations in Bangladesh, but providing very generally small loans to entrepreneurs who haven't had access to formal financing in the past, with the idea that as they build their businesses, they stabilize their lives, their families, their communities. From that approach, which has been fairly successful, we then took the broader view of what other products and services can have a positive impact on their lives. And yes, at this point, we view the provision of those services being much more productive, impactful, possible through formal financial institutions and other for-profit entities. And so the delivery mechanism of the product or service to the client we ultimately want to reach goes through that for-profit mechanism, which is a part of our story. Very quickly, the three portfolios that we have a gateway and microfinance institution investment portfolio that is sort of our bread and butter historical microfinance investment team. We find microfinance institutions, again, that can benefit from the expertise and the capital and the governance that we bring. The second group is our Frontier Investments group. And you're seeing them sort of in order of appearance in the Axion history. When we started looking beyond credit and asking the question what other services can be provided or what other bottlenecks exist within the financial services space, what are the good ideas out there that if funded, if properly cultivated, could either provide these new products and services or otherwise catalyze the industry. So this group is not looking at microfinance institutions, but is looking at what we call beyond microfinance, the sort of surrounding space that provides, again, those ancillary services or new services. They are fashioned as basically a venture equity group. You can see the numbers. They typically invest $1 to $5 million around a Series A, and I'm probably using a lot of investment terms that some of you are more or less familiar with.
But I have to explain that.
Yeah. So these are not startups. These are post-revenue companies. They have a product that is making money, and they are now poised to scale up in their growth. And so that's where this group comes in after the idea, the product, the technology has been proven. And you can see that is we're doing a bit of structuring for what we think will be larger impact. We're transitioning that into a third-party fund, which I'll speak a little bit more about later. The last group is Venture Lab, and that's actually earlier in the life cycle. We realized that there were a lot of good ideas that were basically withering on the vine because they couldn't get funding very early on in their life cycle. So you have a founder who has come up with an innovative idea to tackle a problem within this space, but just can't fund it, can't have enough runway, let's say, in funding to grow the idea to even find out if it's viable. And so this group invests $100,000 to $500,000 in these types of organizations, all for profit, to see if we can help them get their ideas off the ground. Yeah.
I see with all of these different ventures. Can you hear me? Closer. We're co-investing with for-profit organizations and often for-profit investors. And I question, in that kind of relationship, you're making an equity commitment. You can't easily get your money out. How do you ensure that that your tax-exempt purpose, that the organization stays true to the mission that you sought to fund?
Yeah, it's complicated, and it is a constant tension. I think we started out in a place where we tried to build in redemption rights, meaning if the organization, the institution ever veered away from what we thought was the mission, they would have to buy back our shares. In the real world of investing, that is a very tough sell. Institutions and co-investors aren't so willing to give up capital or take capital out of a very nascent organization in order to pay back an investor who's disgruntled for whatever reason. So that's complicated. What we have done is we place a very strong emphasis on the consent rights that we have in the governing documents, meaning, and the one that I think is the most important in this area is we have to approve of any material change in the business of the company. So in our investment documents, they can't really veer away from what we identified as the core business without our approval. So that is sort of what we feel the strongest position we can get, while maintaining, again, a capital structure and a shareholding structure that can include your typical for-profit investors. So I wanted to just show you this slide, which it looks like it pops up slowly. This is there it all is. Okay, so there's a lot here, and I've drawn. And don't worry, because my next slide I'm going to highlight the pieces of our history that are outlined in those boxes, because I think they're an important part of this impact investing narrative. You can see we've done a lot of things. We've been around for 50 years. We actually didn't start as a microcredit organization. We were doing general economic development work in Venezuela. After 10 years, identified credit as a very impactful tool in the work that we were doing, and as an organization sort of focused around it. But that sort of gives you a sense of a lot of the things that we're doing beyond just this investment question. But going to those areas that I identified with the boxes, in 1973, again, 12 years after the organization was founded, we identified microcredit as a tool that could be very impactful. And if we're thinking about how organizations can start to frame their conversations around impact investing, I think one of the first questions is, do we actually have a product or service that could benefit from a commercial approach? Do you have something that's investable? And that is a complicated question. It's difficult. Axiom did not go into this in 1973 thinking this is something that will eventually benefit from a commercial approach. It had the impact approach, or its impact is what led our decision making at that point. And then later on, we sort of, again, organically came to the conclusion that the commercialized approach worked better. But I think that's the first step in the internal conversations you're having is what do we have that actually can benefit from this approach? You can see it took us another 20 years almost to get to a point where we were ready to build an investable institution to deliver this product. So for another 20 years, microfinance, microcredit, was purely an issue for NGOs. So local NGOs around the world were the institutions providing this product. What we learned was that it was very limited in its ability, the NGO approach was very limited in its ability to provide the product to the number of clients basically at the scale that we thought it needed to be delivered to have the impact that we thought was possible. And so in 1992, we led the transformation of Banco Sol, a microfinance institution of Bolivia, from an NGO into a regulated financial institution, which allowed it to take on investor capital. There were other sort of benefits, I think, as well through the regulated approach. We're talking about the banking industry, but really what we were looking for was capital so that this institution could scale itself up. We had to do at that point market analysis. If we do lead this transformation, will it be successful commercially? So we as an NGO had to start thinking differently. Most NGOs are not geared to do sort of commercial market analysis, commercial product analysis, to think about, is this a product that if an institution is delivering it, can it be sustainable? Can it be profitable? Can it attract investors because it sustains that profitability? So those were new ways in which we had to think about things. We also had to find some co-investors and co-supporters who were willing to take along that risk with us. This is something that hadn't been done before. And organizations like the Inter-American Development Bank were very instrumental in taking that first risk with us. And so 20 years later, or actually I'm not talking about now, so a little further down the path, Banco Sol is one of the most respected microfinance institutions in the world. It is not only a large microfinance institution, it's one of the largest banks in Bolivia now. It's been amazingly successful and impactful in the Bolivian community. So we feel that was a good first step. And in the 20 years after that, we led other partners in the transformation from NGOs to commercial, not necessarily banks, but microfinance institutions through that process. So, and from a structuring point of view, if you're wondering, well, how did Accion actually invest its money? At that point, it was purely a balance sheet investment for Accion. We were investing directly and taking equity stakes directly from our balance sheet. So very straightforward, simple investment structuring at that point. You can see the next moment in time that I think is important is 2003, when we led the creation of a fund devoted to investment in microfinance institutions. So we had, at that point from 1992 to 2003, success in learning what makes a good, sustainable, impactful microfinance institution, capable of creating return both on the social side and on the financial side. Those people who had taken the first risk with us had learned that actually this is not as risky as we thought. And so we wanted to take those learnings to a broader group of investors and create a vehicle to aggregate capital, basically. So we created a Cayman holding company so that investors could place their money with us alongside our money, and through a management team provided by Accion, scale up the impact of our capital, meaning Accion as a charity did not have enough donor or grant capital to continue to fund the number of microfinance institutions that we needed to fund. So it was imperative that we find a way to draw in that outside capital and to be creative in creating a vehicle that could capture that capital. That AINV, Accion Investments in Microfinance vehicle, closed a few years back and had annualized returns of 15%, which is very good in any investment context. And so it was quite successful. The institutions, by and large, did quite well, both on the impact and the financial side. So that, again, was in terms of structuring, we had to think through how do we get this capital in. That was a holding company, meaning all of the investors put their money together in one vehicle, which then was invested out. It had a board of directors composed of the various investor representatives. So they also played a very active governance and learning role, which was intentional on our part because, again, part of our mission is to catalyze investor capital to come into the space for larger impact. And it was a very important part of how we set that up. the last, let's see, in 2007, a very significant event happened in the microfinance space and in Accion's history, and that was an IPO of one of our portfolio companies, Compartamos Bank in Mexico. That is important because then we had to say, all right, now we as an NGO, we have realized a significant amount of gain from one of our portfolio investments. What can we do now? So both from an internal point of view, we had to stop and we went through a strategic process to reevaluate. Now that we have created social impact, but also have greatly increased our balance sheet through this portfolio company, what can we do now? So while I think this is not a common occurrence, particularly in the microfinance space, there's only been one other large IPO in the microfinance space since then, SKS in India. This was truly transformational for Accion, and it was a signal to the investment industry at large that microfinance institutions not only are targets for private investment, ultimately can be possibly publicly funded through the public market. So a very important event. In addition to a lot of the things you see in that large sort of timeline, the Compartamos IPO and money has allowed us to expand our investment activity. And two of the groups that I mentioned earlier, the Frontier Investments team and the Venture Lab team, are funded directly from the proceeds of the Compartamos IPO. So you can see how the impact, the financial return, those decisions that we made before we even knew that there could be that much return, then allowed us to expand our mission and to have a much larger impact in the financial services space.
I was wondering, the microfinance space has expanded dramatically since 1973 when you innovated.
Yeah.
And I wonder, to what extent has increasing competition affected the way that you deploy your resources, invest in businesses, and how you select those opportunities?
Yeah, good question. We early on it was very easy to be a trailblazer because no trails had been blazed. There was no competition. You're right. At this point, there are a lot of people working in the microfinance space. We have a fairly, I would say, robust analytical tool that we use to identify new markets. And a big piece of that is there already a mature and scaled up microfinance institution or institutions operating in that area? If that already exists, then our capital isn't needed, our expertise isn't needed. So we really do look to see where we can provide it, particularly in the microfinance institution field. We really do try to analyze that. And I think a good example, the last country that we entered was Myanmar, which I think, as many of you know, just opened up generally in the past few years. So that's obviously a place where there wasn't a mature microfinance or other financial market, and so that was an obvious place for us to deploy our capital.
And just based on my experience working with Accion, I would say that you also offer a competitive advantage vis-a-vis some of the just financial investors, because you're willing to work with them at an early stage, provide technical assistance, and also improved governance, which can attract other money.
Right.
Well-run organizations have a much easier time raising capital, particularly if they're in challenging markets like Myanmar.
Yeah, and that plays itself out in a few different ways, including there are investors who are willing to only go into markets like those if we are leading the way. So they need us to be involved in the equation before they think they're willing to take that risk. And we think that that's a very important role for us to play. Just in terms of impact, I want, obviously we've had financial return, but here I wanted to note a few of the ways that we identify the impact that we've had. We've created a number of MFIs, helped them transform. In addition to a loan portfolio, we track savings portfolio. We talk about clients protected. That's actually a fairly new initiative. In the 2008-2009 in India, there was a huge microfinance crisis. Many of you might be familiar with it, the Andhra Pradesh crisis. That led to the industry stepping back and saying, wait a second, while we weren't the bad actors ourselves, what can we do as an industry in order to make sure, or try to make sure, that this type of situation doesn't come up again? And one of the things that Axion, through its Center for Financial Inclusion, has done, again funded by proceeds of investments, is say what principles need to be in place in order to protect clients. So a big part of our mission now is to say it's not only enough, or we've made it explicit, that it's not only enough that you're providing products and services, you have to do it in an appropriate way. And the client protection principles that have been developed and actually now adopted by many of our co-investors. I was involved in a deal a few months ago when one of our co-investors, who I think just wasn't familiar with the history of the SMART campaign and the client protection principles, said, Kevin, we need to include the client protection principles in what we ask of our portfolio company. And that was actually an exciting moment for me, because it was someone else coming and demanding something that we usually put in place. But it is an important piece of what we're doing. I include our 2014 financials. It's our most recent financial statement, just so you can see what has been the impact on our financials of this type of activity. And I think the most glaring thing many of you see is a discrepancy between revenues and expenses. And I think I probably already answered the question of how do you bridge that gap? And we are funding that through assets that we've gained through our portfolio company sales. So our board has made the strategic decision that these returns on investments are not to sit idle. We're going to be very aggressive in funding institutions and increasing our impact. So you see that discrepancy. Obviously, that can't go forever, but we are being very purposeful in spending more than our annual revenues in order to use those proceeds for our mission. I wanted to highlight a couple of other things. How has this impacted us as an organization? It happened organically. So I think there was never a point in time where we said, what do we need to have in place in order to make sure we are a good, well-run impact investing NGO? It sort of fits in spurts of change. Some more complicated than others. I think in addition to being a standard project management NGO, we now have to be a portfolio management NGO. What does that mean? You view that relationship much differently than I think you view a typical project relationship. On the financial statement side, we suddenly have, I think I asked before I came over, we have, I think, 60 portfolio companies on our direct balance sheet right now. And so from an audit perspective, what is that? You have to have valuations of those assets. It's and those are they're sort of placed in different entities depending on where they're located. And so there are audits at the local level, then it rolls up in the consolidation. And so there's a very complicated financial statement audit piece of this that I think many NGOs haven't faced, and it's a very real piece of it. From a talent and infrastructure point of view, if you're going to do investment work well, you have to have people who understand that world. And that's something that your standard NGO doesn't have. And so to really do the financial modeling and the investment modeling and to speak the language to potential co-investors that you need to speak, you have to have people who are familiar with that area. Can it be learned? Yes. But again, if you're making a considered decision to start that function, you absolutely do need to have people in place that can play that role. Lastly, I'll mention something near and dear to everyone's heart, and that is fundraising and communications. It's complicated. It's very, very complicated for us to have a balance sheet that is quite healthy and to go out to donors and say, we still need help. We have a mission that needs to be funded. Yes, we've had successful returns on some of the investments we made, but that may not always be the case. And we have a number of activities that are unrelated to investments that still need donor and grant support. So that is a complicated thing. The more investments that you do, the more you talk about doing investments, the more people think of you as an investor rather than perhaps an NGO. And that is a very complicated line to walk. And I think maybe some of the others will speak about that as well.
Thank you, Kevin. That was terrific. Just Well, one of the questions I was going to ask you, you've already partially answered, if not fully, which is you guys have had tremendous success, obviously. You also have a somewhat unique model compared to the impact investing opportunities and activities that those folks here in the room and on the webinar either are currently involved in or are contemplating getting involved in. But still, there's some terrific lessons kind of for all NGOs looking into this area or dipping their toe in this area. Beyond what you've already just mentioned at the end there, any other kind of important lessons or other things that you would kind of pull out and share with the broader universe of NGOs here?
Well, I noticed there was a very important piece that I didn't mention, and I was going to say a little more about the structuring side and the considerations. And so I think that's something that you have to be willing to consider. If you're setting up vehicles or institutions that are investable and you want non-NGOs to come in, you have to create something that looks familiar to investors. And I mentioned we set up a holding company in the Cayman Islands to attract a group of global investors. We are working on a fund right now where we're setting up what is a limited partnership structure in Cayman, which is a slightly different beast where the investors are fairly passive. They sign up for the investment thesis that you've put together, but they then stand back and let the investment company sort of play out the investment thesis. You have to think about how you want to invest. I think many of us just think of equity investments, but at various stages, different types of capital makes more sense. Is it better to provide debt, convertible debt, preference shares, equity? So you have a lot of decisions to make depending on the needs of the institution based on the analysis that you've done. We've dealt with all of that, but we haven't dealt with some of the new things that are happening as well. And I think probably some of you have heard about public benefit corporations, LC3s, or LC3s. There are new corporate structures that have been set up in the United States in order to help us think through the question of really how do we balance social and financial when you're running a for-profit company where historically companies are forced to go after the financial side first or to support the financial side first. How can we create corporate statutes that actually allow to place social side by side? So there's a lot of innovation happening there, and I think those will become more and more interesting, I think, to NGOs as they're trying to balance that, but still very early on. And the last piece is tax structuring, which is something most NGOs don't spend a lot of time thinking about. We love our tax exemption. We don't spend a lot of time thinking about tax structuring, but when you're setting up vehicles to bring in larger sources of capital, you have to think through, okay, what sort of building blocks of entities will create the type of structure that is interesting to a global and diverse investor group. And it gets very complicated very quickly, but that is something, again, that we wouldn't have thought about as an NGO until we started thinking about how do we draw more capital in order to have more impact.
And that was my last question to you, and then we'll get to Camille. And that is 501c3 organizations, and it's unique amongst all tax-exempt organizations that C3s are subject to this private benefit doctrine, which basically says that in all of your activities and programs, you cannot have any significant program activity that benefits a private party, individual company, industry sector more than it benefits the public. And it's both a qualitative analysis and a quantitative analysis. And it's a very amorphous analysis. It's a very gray test. There's no black and white rules in this area. It's a very difficult test, even to understand, never mind to apply. Yet it's, in my experience, and I'm sure in all of yours, been one of the biggest challenges about the impact investing area is how do you structure these relationships with investors, partnerships between your nonprofit and for-profits in a way that ensures that public benefit, the furtherance of your tax-exempt mission and purpose, is always dominant over the benefit to those private parties. And don't get me wrong, you can have benefit to private parties. You wouldn't have impact investing if there weren't benefit to private parties. In virtually everything a nonprofit does, you go out and you hire a contractor to perform services overseas. That contractor has some private benefit from getting paid, but the public benefit outweighs that. These situations, though, are a lot different and murkier. So my question to you is, just not getting too much in the weeds, but from a high-level perspective, are there any guiding principles that you use to help make sure that these investment structures and activities benefit the public, namely, in your case, individuals who are trying to receive microfinancing loans and other opportunities, that outweighs the private benefit to the other investors or other individuals or companies?
Yeah, it's a very difficult question because, as you said, that analysis is quite murky generally. And when you are thinking specifically about investment activity, there's very little C3 guidance out there. And what we've had to look to for guidance is actually the private foundation rules, so the PRI rules, because there's actually more substance there and more guidance there. And we have actually developed an internal tool where we evaluate each investment by investment, to determine, calibrate that mix of social benefit with whatever incidental private benefit might exist. And it has to come out on the side of maintaining enough social benefit to outweigh that private benefit. And what I think the reality, though, as you guys know, is we might come out that way, but we might be in a position at some point down the road where we have to defend that. And so what we've done is create a process based on the guidance that's available where we could reasonably justify that position that we've taken. So again, there's a tension that is there that you can't eliminate, but we've developed a process that makes it comfortable to make those investments.
And process is very important, and documentation of the process. We've probably represented about 150 C3 organizations and IRS audits in the last 10 years or so. And those that had good processes, written processes, good documentation of the processes they followed, generally come out much better and give us a lot more ammunition to work with in those examinations than those who don't. And then the other thing it sounds like you do is making sure that you have a key role in the governance of these institutions, because that's an absolutely critical fact to making sure that they are serving those public purposes that you're espousing and that fit within your mission.
That's part of the analysis in that matrix, is what continued role beyond just the investment will we have, and that brings into play the management and technical assistance. So we have sort of our hands on the steering wheel from that perspective, and then on the governance side as well.
Great. Thank you, Kevin. Yep. Camille, you're up.
Well, hello. Can you hear me? Okay. Can I have this, the little pen? My name is Camille Cook. I'm a senior attorney with the Nature Conservancy's legal department. I'm looking at one of my colleagues right down this row, and I'm sure she's thinking, why did Camille come in here and do a Chevy Chase skit from Saturday Night Live? And from those of you who watched the show in the 1970s, you may know what I'm talking about. So anyway, I usually don't fall when I enter a room, but this was a special case. So I hope to continue to provide enjoyment and entertainment with this presentation. Anyway, I'm going to work my way through the slides. As I said, I'm with the Nature Conservancy, and I think this is a good panel discussion because I am familiar with Accion's work, but we actually are in quite different positions. Like Action, we are a well-established 501c3. We were created in 1951 to protect and preserve the land and water on which all life depends. And we now have operations in all 50 states, in 35 countries, and we are, in fact, the second largest private landowner in the United States, which you may not have known. And so we have a very large footprint. However, impact investing has always been, up until this moment, a more sporadic, project-by-project, less institutionalized endeavor at the Nature Conservancy. However, about 2 years ago, the Nature Conservancy decided to create the NatureVest division, which is dedicated to impact investing. I'm going to try to move this. Did that work? Okay. So why did they create the NatureVest division? We clearly have been doing quite well using sort of traditional sources of funding, philanthropy, concessional loans from multilaterals. We work a lot with the U.S. government. But we really feel that impact investing, to use words I think you've heard elsewhere today, can be catalytic because it can help magnify and amplify the conservation work that we do, and we can speed it in a way that is quite difficult with pure philanthropy. And I'm going to talk about one of the projects that we recently closed using impact capital as an example of the kind of work that we can achieve and the speed with which we can achieve it. At the Nature Conservancy, we view impact capital as raising third-party capital in service of conservation. Another goal of the NatureVest division, and really a role that we feel we are uniquely well positioned to play, is as an incubator of ideas. So he was talking about, Kevin was talking about these, a lot of people in the world with great ideas, but they're really not investable. They don't have a solid business plan. They really don't know how to operate a business. At the Nature Conservancy, we are quite blessed. We have this perfect marriage of an enormous array of very skilled and innovative scientists. We have a lot of policy experts, and now we have an impact investing division, and we can bring together all of those skills to create conservation businesses projects. Will we invest in other people's businesses? Sure, but we feel we're uniquely well positioned to create them ourselves. And how do we do that? We structure transactions that are replicable and scalable. That's also a theme you're going to hear consistently. Most social and conservation impact projects really need scale in order to achieve a material benefit for the public. Otherwise, really the burdens on capital are too great.
And Camille, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm guessing that for most of those in the room and on the webinar today that the same applies to you, that whatever impact you can have, whatever your social mission and purpose is, whatever you can do directly on your own, the impact that you can have when you're bringing in for-profit and an investor capital is going to scale it dramatically. And that's, to me, one of the most exciting things about impact investing is that it's not only a new source of funds, it's an ability to take the beneficial work you're doing in the United States and around the world and scale it up in a much more massive way.
Mm-hmm. That's right. We also look to source capital from new supporters. There are many different types of organizations that are looking to integrate conservation into their investment strategies, but they simply can't make donations like an investment fund, a pension fund. They're not a likely donor to the Nature Conservancy, but they can invest in some of our projects. And last, a goal of the NatureVest division is to share our knowledge and experience so that others can innovate and replicate these ideas elsewhere. The kinds of projects, this is just, I'm going to go through quickly the kinds of projects that NatureVest will support. We're interested in supporting all conservation, but at the end of the day, we too have limited resources. We're a new division, and all of our projects have to map to the Nature Conservancy's global strategies. These are landscape conservation. That's really the sort of typical bread and butter conservation work that we've done for the last 60 years. Green infrastructure, we're helping to develop green infrastructure, perhaps even in this city, to abate stormwater runoff into places like the Anacostia and Chesapeake Bay. Debt restructuring for conservation. I don't know if you saw that announcement around the COP conference in Paris, but there are debt restructurings where PNC will work to lower the debt burden for a nation and then use that savings to be deployed to improve conservation activities in that nation. Sustainable agricultural efforts, probably some of the work that Acción is doing. Improving water security, and I'll be talking about an investment fund that we're working on in Australia. And last, fisheries reform, again providing incentives to small-scale fishermen to improve their practices to make fishing a more sustainable livelihood. So of course, impact investing has a number of dimensions, and I'll just touch on a few ways that the Nature Conservancy, through its NatureVest division, will engage in the impact investing space. We'll make loans and equity investments in conservation businesses. I would say very similar to what Acción would do. We develop investment funds. Again, you've heard that before. We also develop our own conservation businesses. This is the incubation idea, a role that we feel we're able to play because of the diverse resources within the TNC family. We manage those businesses, and we also market financial interests. And that ties into some of the issues or risks associated with impact investing. So some of the key issues that we grapple with, again, I'm just going to touch on a few that I think will resonate with this group. Selecting the right strategic partner is essential. Much like selecting the right investee company, doing your due diligence, we often have to partner with for-profit investment managers, and conservation funds or conservation activities take place over a long period of time, a decade or more, and you really have to vet your partners. They have to present the creditworthiness, the skills that you need, but also more importantly, are we sure we're aligned in terms of our mission? And they may not be exactly a for-profit conservation organization, but we really have to get comfortable that they're going to walk the walk for the next 10 years. Otherwise, you're going to have serious issues. And like Acción, we seek to enshrine those principles in our contractual arrangements. This is not going to be guesswork. We're not going to seek not to find ourselves in serious difficulty with this partner 5, 6, 10 years down the line. Selecting the right vehicle, I couldn't emphasize that enough. You have to present yourself, even though you're a nonprofit and this is an impact business, you really do have to present the financial product in a way that is accessible, meaningful, and familiar to the investing public. Many people like to do well and do good, but it has to look like a sensible investment. And so that's always an anchor for how we structure our transactions.
Camille, can I stop you for a second? Can you give everyone maybe just a few examples of some of the more common vehicles that you guys do utilize?
Yes. I would say limited liability companies are organized in Delaware. I mean, if we're establishing a business that's primarily oriented activities in the United States, our preferred jurisdiction is Delaware. Preferred form is a limited liability company because it provides a great deal of flexibility in allocating voting rights versus economic rights. And you can, at least in theory, eliminate your fiduciary duties to your investors. That may not be the best marketing approach, but it is possible. We also, have the ability to joint venture very flexibly in that way. So we like the LLC structure. Obviously for investment funds, most of them are structured as limited partnerships. Again, we tend to favor Delaware. We have not done any offshore jurisdictions other than Australia yet. But again, we would be open to Cayman Islands. One question that occurred to me as he was talking was, are most of your investors foreign investors? Is that why you domiciled your fund in the Cayman Islands?
Yeah, that's right. Most of our co-investors do not come from the United States, and because of that, they actually have a very clear perspective that they do not want to be exposed to U.S. tax code. So we have to find a meaningful offshore jurisdiction in order to harness their capital.
Yes. Okay. And I'll touch on just one more point here, since we already, different speakers have touched on others, but liability management. One issue that has been of particular focus since the Nature Conservancy launched its impact investing initiative is really to get a grounding, a firm understanding of the securities regulations, which are in flux. I mean, they've been in flux since the financial crisis. There have been some changes. Those of us who have been involved in securities transactions for several years have noted there have been changes of approach within the SEC. Some make it more flexible pursuant to the Jobs Act, and in other ways there seems to be a tightening of the kinds of activities that the SEC wants parties to undertake without registration. Two areas that are very important for us is ensuring first and foremost that we do not conduct registered offerings. We have no problem with registered offerings in theory, but given the scale of the transactions right now, the financial cost and the time that it takes to get to market for a retail product, particularly with the kinds of risks associated with our work, we think it's not the appropriate investor set. So we really focus on private placements, ideally, Rule 506 private placements where you're just targeting accredited investors and you don't necessarily have to give them any particular scope of disclosure. So for us, that's our preferred approach. In addition, we do involve ourselves in marketing securities, and we do it under a safe harbor which allows us to avoid registration as broker-dealers. But it is a path that you have to navigate quite carefully. And we are constantly talking to Securities Counsel to make sure that we're following the path correctly, because broker-dealer registration is also quite onerous, and it is an area that the SEC is becoming more conservative about and not less.
Before you leave the slide, you want to just touch briefly on the last 3 bullet points that I think they are very relevant here.
Yes, okay, sure. I would pull together conflicts of interest and tax considerations. These are clearly essential elements of any co-investing or joint venture proposition. Where the Nature Conservancy as a 501c3 is doing business with a co-investor. It could be a private financial institution. It could be another shareholder in an entity or a co-investor in that entity. And the question we have to ask ourselves is the venture that we're designing substantially related to the Nature Conservancy's tax-exempt purpose, not somebody else's tax-exempt purpose, or to just furthering the commercial returns. So what we seek to do is to design our companies, put inside of the bylaws, the articles, rules regarding the scope of activity. We are not going to engage in any activity that will cause us to lose the benefit of our exemption. And obviously there are materiality tests, and we're a very large organization, but our view is we don't even want to go down that path. We prefer to use our resources in support of ventures that are clearly and manifestly in support of conservation as a primary goal. Also, of course, we deal with private benefit issues. In these transactions, you have an array of service providers, you have lenders, you have co-investors, just a real range of possible ways that private benefit can arise, and also possibly inurement, where you have much less room to maneuver. And so we really have to be sensitive to those issues.
Camille, can you just talk for a minute to the control issue that I know is kind of runs through your impact investing guidelines and rules that you guys follow internally. But you want to speak to that for a minute in terms of how you deal with that issue?
Sure. He's referring to, I shared with him a copy of our impact investing guidelines, which we created this year. We've always had a related entities policy, which is required under the tax code, but we really felt we needed something more prescriptive to give us and all of our staff a clear path forward on creating these ventures, and control is key for us. It doesn't mean that the Nature Conservancy has to make every decision, but when we structure a venture, we seek for the Nature Conservancy to have control over the sort of major business decisions that could determine or affect whether this is substantially related to TNC's business or not. And we seek to affect that at all governance levels: voting rights as an investor, board governance. We may limit the amount of equity that any particular private investor may take on. So part of this is reputational. If one investor is acquiring 90% of the equity, yet it's still a conservation business, that's certainly possible, but it's really causing or creating a fact pattern that may not be ideal for us. And so in the best of all worlds, we seek to have a very dispersed investor pool and without a single for-profit investor, certainly without significant control rights over the company.
I have a question around that. Do you also think through possible exit mechanisms as you're putting these relationships in place?
Yes. I mean, in many cases, the Nature Conservancy is the anchor investor. It's probably one of the reasons other people are coming in. These are deals that we're creating, but for example, we do have equity investments in other companies, and we've tried to institute one of the mechanisms that he referred to before, like a redemption back to the company, or a redemption to a key strategic investor. You know, if you want us to get out, that's something we'll consider. You can buy us out over, after say 5 years, if we haven't managed to sell, buy us out with a minimum internal rate of return. And we think that's a pretty fair deal. You can't get it in every deal, and in many cases your co-investors may not have the money, but at least it's a possibility. There are also, of course, tag-along and drag-along rights that you would want to incorporate into any shareholders agreement to make sure that you have some flexibility and room to maneuver.
And then you want to speak finally to the publicity issue?
Yes. And the publicity issue that I'm raising here has to do with sort of what I see as a bit of a cultural tension between the nonprofit world, in which we are very much in support of transparency and openness, and let's talk about our business and share our ideas, and the financial world, especially in the private placement world, in which they want you to keep it quiet. Investors may not want you talking about who they are, but you certainly should not be using a public forum like this, for example, to explain exactly what your investment returns are, why, and providing potentially non-public information to an array of individuals who may take advantage of that. So that's been an area of where we've had to sort of discipline ourselves somewhat, because it does run counter to our nature. We want to talk about our business, but that's not what some investors expect, and so we have to temper that a bit.
Okay, thanks. And I know we only have a very short amount of time left. They're going to have to kind of run through the rest of the slides quickly, but I think those are important points that have a lot of applicability.
Certainly. Okay, I'm just going to move off my slides and just tell you about what I think is just the coolest project that we have done so far. These are early days, but this was a great accomplishment. It's called the Murray-Darling Basin Balanced Water Fund, and I challenge you to say that 3 times. So I'll refer to it as the fund. Australia, as you know, is the driest continent on Earth. Any of you who've seen Mad Max, it's true. It is incredibly water insecure, and this is one of the Nature Conservancy's core strategies to promote the proper monetization and use of water, and also to promote environmental watering. We were able to achieve all of these objectives in balance, along with social outcomes. How did we do it? We designed, this is what our incubation concept, we designed a fund, an investment fund, a traditional vehicle in Australia, so that the investors could invest in a fund that acquired water rights, which is possible in Australia because they have developed markets, and that a portion of those water rights every year, 10 to 40%, are donated to the environment to conduct environmental watering activities. And that makes sense commercially. You may be gaping, but that does make sense commercially because we follow the natural watering rhythms in Australia. So when there's a lot of water, it's very rainy, water rights are cheap. So we donate them to the environment when they're cheap. When it's very dry, water rights are very expensive, and only 10% are donated to the environment. What did the key benefit of this transaction was scale. We were able to raise $25 million in capital with an aim of raising up to $100 million in capital over the next 2 years, and to conduct immediate environmental watering activities. Our first event takes place in a couple of months. which is a little bit of a secret, but we're really very happy and positive about the reception that we've gotten in the Australian market, which is not as advanced as the United States in terms of social impact and environmental impact. We got a great reception. We have a broad array of investors ranging from superannuation funds rather, all the way to just individual high net worth individuals. So we're very optimistic about what this fund is going to be able to achieve. There were of course challenges associated with that, cost, liability issues, but we feel they were more than worth it given the magnitude of the benefit that the fund was able to achieve. And just touching on this last slide, which I borrowed from Tom, not that one, it's the wrong one. Oh well, sorry, it doesn't matter. Just simply that impact investing has had an impact on the Nature Conservancy, and we've really had to modify, not overhaul, but modify how we conduct some of our activities. I'd say key innovations: joint venture policy, having something much more targeted, a more streamlined and nimble governance process because there are always changes in these deals. You can't, the market changes too quickly to have board meetings every 3 months. And the last point is an emphasis on asset management. It is not enough to raise money and pat yourself on the back. You have to perform, and you have to have an internal infrastructure to support that performance. So those are the insights that we have, at least so far, but we're very optimistic.
Camille, could you maybe give an example or two of how your governance process has changed and evolved in this arena, both at the staff level as well as with the volunteer leadership level?
Mm-hmm. We always, when he talks about volunteer leadership, he's referring to our trustees. We have over 1,000 of them, and we do work very closely with them. These are volunteers who give us the benefit of their ideas. And we, in the impact investing space, we do have to be careful about how much information we can give to third parties who could theoretically take advantage of them. And so, you know, we're still working through the process, but it could, to some degree, change the kind of conversations we have with them. In the past, we shared everything with them. In some cases, they would even assist us in negotiating agreements with counterparties. But in the impact investing space, because of the very confidential nature of these financial dealings, we often find ourselves having to pull away from that traditional relationship. And just in terms of TNC's governance, we simply created sort of subcommittees, if you will, to our board so that they can respond to changes in a proposal as the project is implemented.
Yeah, I would add to that. We now have to have monthly committee meetings, investment committee meetings, because our portfolio is so active. And that's from a board of 15 board members, and there's a subgroup of that is giving us a day, not a day, but a few hours every month in order to review those activities. And I would say the expertise you need on that committee is also maybe a little different than the background of a lot of board members. Because they're thinking through investment, modeling impact, et cetera, they need to be familiar and versed in that world.
That's a great point. I've got one final question I'm going to ask you, Camille, and then we're going to wrap up. Since I'm asking you because TNC is a bit newer to this world than Axion, what do you think has been the biggest challenge to TNC since you've kind of dipped your toe, maybe a little more than dip it in the water, but since you've gotten into this area, what's been the biggest challenge, be it operational, governance, legal, or otherwise?
I would say the biggest challenge has been simply identifying the opportunities and crafting opportunities for the investing public, and identifying which slice of the investing public is interested in which transaction. I think it's marrying the proposal with the investor class, because we have access to a very wide array of potential supporters, but slicing and dicing and finding, you know, is it the completely environmentally minded individual? Is it potentially USAID? Is it a European governmental source? Or is it a financial institution? And really teasing out, getting deeper than simply, I want to do impact investing, to let me more effectively target investors with particular investment opportunities.
Thank you. Thank you to all of our panelists. Kevin and Camille, terrific job today. Really, really helpful and informative. Kevin, thanks especially for traveling down from Boston. Tom and Bonnie Marie from Inside NGO, thank you so much for co-sponsoring this program, and again our one in March. Thank you all for participating, and look forward to seeing you back here next month. Thank you.
Thank you.